Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining. My name is Ernesto Villaseñor, and I'm the Federal Campaign Coordinator with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. What I am about to show you all, which I'm really excited to talk about, is our Electrify Everything Roadshow, which is a work that we've been doing over the last several months since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed into federal law last year. And we've been going all over the DMV, presenting all the great benefits that consumers, tax exempt organizations, and pretty much a lot of individuals can qualify and tap into as it relates to the Inflation Reduction Act and the federal tax credits, rebates, grants, and funding opportunities that are available. Before I continue on, just want to let you all know that we'll be covering topics on how you can move towards a clean, affordable energy future with the help from the Inflation Reduction Act. And we're going to be breaking down those topics in the 6 following ways. So electrification, when you're thinking about upgrading your home with weatherization, solar panels, and energy efficient appliances, as well if you want to make your home energy smart and environmental friendly. That will be covered in the electrification section. Electric vehicles, if you're considering on purchasing an electric vehicle, we got you covered. We'll be covering the incentives and support for your electric vehicle journey in that section. Next, we will have buildings. And this is going more towards local municipalities who are looking at making that transition towards adopting greener building codes and kind of going towards that net zero development, as well as making their buildings more sustainable and eco-friendly. That's what we'll be covering in the building section. Next, we will have energy transition. So funding for energy communities, guiding them from fossil fuels to cleaner energy. That's where we'll be covering that, as well as support for communities who are affected by energy-related health disparities. We'll be covering that in that bubble. The next bubble would be resilient communities. So focusing on rural electrification and connecting rural areas to green energy, as well as looking at rural energy co-ops, how they can transition and decarbonize with IRA assistance, in addition to also environmental justice funding for frontline communities and communities that have been disproportionately impacted by environmental injustices and climate change. Last but not least, we'll be talking about agriculture. So this will be looking at funding opportunities for farmers, ranchers, local and state governments, as well as other private parties who could tap into funding that has been set aside under the IRA to help protect soil, conserve land, and enhance wetlands with sustainable practices, amongst other practices. So we'll be covering that in the agriculture section. We'll be making this recording and presentation as navigable as we can with these. So in the description where this video is uploaded, we will add and you will see clickable minute markers. So you could just click on a particular marker and it'll take you to that respective topic that I just mentioned, that you're curious about. And it will allow you to have a more personalized journey through the information that we disseminate. So let's go ahead and get started and talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. So what is the Inflation Reduction Act? What is the IRA? It is not the Irish Republican Army, as many of us may think when we see or hear the acronym IRA. It is not that. So picture a colossal federal law that's boasting an impressive financial magnitude of a staggering $738 billion. That's what the Inflation Reduction Act is. It was passed this time around last year, so around mid-August 2023, and we're just hitting the 1-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act. So this ambitious piece of federal legislation has been meticulously crafted with the primary goal of taming inflation and securing economic stability for our nation. So curbing inflation by reducing the deficit. Also within the Inflation Reduction Act, there was legislation and language to help lower prescription drug prices, to help consumers and individuals be able to access medication and prescription drugs at a much more affordable price. So that's one of the other things that the IRA aimed to do. And then also too, it includes a 15% corporate tax. So increasing the corporate tax to 15%, it should not say tax credit right there, to generate more revenue and to generate substantial revenue while encouraging businesses to thrive and flourish. So that's really on a larger level what the Inflation Reduction Act has aimed to do. But the big part about the Inflation Reduction Act is there's this large amount of money, a monumental amount of funding that was set aside through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a monumental investment worth a jaw-dropping $370 billion into our domestic energy production. This ambitious move marks a historic turning point in our nation's journey towards a cleaner and more sustainable energy future. And there's more to this grand initiative. As the energy production focus, the IRA dedicates special attention to promoting clean energy solutions. So this is, and we'll go into it more specifically, the IRA includes, over the next 10 years, those $370 billion will include tax credits for solar panels and electric vehicles, plus incentives to build solar batteries and other green technologies, $60 billion for community and environmental justice funding. So that's when we're, as I previously mentioned, those environmental justice and climate change grants and funding opportunities through the EPA, through the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as shifting from fossil fuel towards cleaner energy in rural communities and connecting rural communities to the clean energy and modernizing our energy grid. That's what those $60 billion are doing, including $214 billion in clean energy tax incentives and investments for more regional governmental impact and funding. So we have $214 billion going into that, $33 billion to decarbonizing our public transportation and expanding it and improving it. Some of the campaigns that we're seeing that is the greening of of school buses in a lot of cities, counties, and states across the country. So we're seeing a lot of funding starting to go towards that. $27 billion for Clean Energy Technology Accelerator. So accelerating and modernizing and incentivizing to create and further develop our clean energy technology, as well as I mentioned, modernizing transformers and our energy grid system. Then there's also $2.6 billion to conserve coastal habitats here at the Chesapeake Bay, one of the most amazing and beautiful bays. Climate change has had its disproportionate impact on coastal erosion. So there is a lot of funding available to conserve coastal habitats. And you'll see also a lot of that funding in agricultural production to conserve over-farmed land, as well as to mitigate any farming that is being done in wetlands to kind of shift it back. And then also too, for consumers such as myself and yourself, $9 billion to electrify appliances. So if you're in the market of purchasing appliances, or your appliances are kind of reaching their end, or if they're very energy inefficient, there's $9 billion to electrify appliances. So that's kind of that $370 billion from the IRA. That's kind of where a lot of that money is being shifted towards as it relates to kind of modernizing and boosting domestic energy production, making our energy much more green, and then also tackling climate change. So that's really where you see a lot of the $370 billion going towards too. And I want to share one of this graph. And as you could see in this graph right here, that little purple line right in the middle, as we're looking towards net zero and then kind of reducing greenhouse gas emissions on the 2005 levels, this is kind of where that funding is going towards too, that the IRA set up. So as we're looking at reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dioxide emissions, that purple line that you see on this graph, it's going to bring it to 42% below 2005 levels. So as we're looking towards net zero, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and also to just kind of going towards that larger macro levels of doing everything, anything and everything that we can to reduce, to slow down, reduce, and go back towards the increase of climate change and the increase of global average temperatures. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to be doing a monumental amount of work over the next 10 years to get us towards those goals. So now I will be talking about electrification. And we're shifting gears a little bit here. So with electrification, and one of the things that I want to go ahead and explain, with Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to have tax credits and tax rebates available, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on what those tax credits and those tax rebates are. But let me go ahead and explain kind of the difference between a tax credit and a rebate, which could be pretty confusing, especially if you're not an accountant or a tax preparer or a tax lawyer, which I'm neither of those three. So the difference between a tax credit and a rebate, which the Inflation Reduction Act calls out both tax credits and rebates. When you think of a tax credit, and when I'm talking about tax credit, a tax credit is a dollar for dollar reduction in the amount of income tax you would otherwise owe. So, and you claim a tax credit as part of your annual tax return when you're doing taxes. So let's say you make a purchase in 2023, you will then claim that tax credit on your 2023 tax return, which you would file in 2024. So for example, let's say in 2023, if you owe $1,500 in federal income taxes and you claim a $1,200 federal tax credit for energy efficiency equipment, whether that is a new heat pump or an induction stove. If you claim a $1,200 federal tax credit for that, you will now owe $300 in federal income tax and taxes, which is an amazing thing to do, and that's how the tax credit works. Or as opposed to now when we're talking about rebates, tax rebates, it's an upfront discount that gives you cash back after you make a purchase, and it's typically more quickly available and readily to you than a tax credit would be. A lot of these rebates, and there will be more language later on through the IRS later in 2023, are point of sale rebates. So a point of sale rebate will give you that cash back when you make that purchase immediately. So effectively reducing that cost of the item purchase. And more often than not, rebates do not rely on income levels to receive a benefit. And depending upon your eligibility for either a tax credit or a tax rebate under the Inflation Reduction Act, in some circumstances, you can claim both. And I will go ahead in a little bit on this amazing calculator that will allow you to further learn and see how you could get those tax rebates and tax credits with the calculator. So let's go ahead and dive into it. There's this amazing tool by Rewiring America, is the Rewiring America Savings Calculator, which you will see right here popping up on my screen. And the great thing about it, and the link you'll see right there on the top left-hand corner, and we will include this link as well, is you have a savings calculator. The amazing thing is that this tool is bilingual, it's in English and Spanish. And let's say, for example, if you're a homeowner filing head of household size of 4 with a household income of around 150,000, and you live in this particular zip code, 21209, you input that information based on you hit calculate. And the great thing about it is that here are the incentives that you qualify under the Inflation Reduction Act. As you're electrifying your home, as you're applying for tax credits and also looking for tax rebates, depending on those appliances or upgrades that you're doing. These are the amount of incentives that you'll potentially get. And it's an estimated value, it's not an exact value. Upfront discounts are up to $14,000. Available tax credits are around $22,800. And then the other great thing about this calculator is that it gives you the estimated energy savings per year. So you're looking at potentially saving around a little bit over $1,500 based on that information that we inputted. Being a homeowner, head of household size of 4, income of around $150,000, and living in 21209. The great thing about it is that as you scroll down through this calculator, you will see those particular incentives, that particular item that qualifies for an electrification rebate, the amount, the timeline. So this is the timeline that is included on here is the IRS timeline, where they're going to be providing exact guidelines on how to file that and get those forms, so that when you're doing your taxes for 2023 and 2024. And the cool thing about it is that each item gives you more information on that particular item, that particular amount, and how that amount is broken down. And as you scroll down through this, it goes down to the tax credit section, which gives you, if you're looking at battery storage installation, geothermal heat installation, that percentage of tax credit. So that percentage, the 30%, that's 30% of the total cost of that project. Of course, it is contingent on your income, and then and kind of where your income status is, whether you're low income, middle income, which again, a lot of that is census tract based. But the good thing about it is that this Rewiring America IRA calculator does that for you. And it also gives you a timeline as to when it's available. Let's go ahead and play a bit with this calculator, and then we'll go ahead into those tax credits and those tax rebates that I was explaining. So let's say you're interested in getting a heat pump air conditioner or a heater. Let's go, more info. So the good thing about it, like I mentioned earlier, it explains what it is. A heat pump, air conditioner, heater gives you the average lifespan of that particular appliance, and then it gives you the health benefits as well. So heat pump, single electric appliance that can replace your traditional air conditioner and home heating system. And it gives you how efficient they are. And here's how it breaks down that amount. So the incentives and costs. And then, like I mentioned earlier, you can combine these electrification rebates with tax credits for additional savings. So if you're, for example, if you're from a low income household, so under 80% of the area median income, this particular electrification rebate for this heat pump air conditioner covers 100% of a heat pump cost up to $8,000. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, for moderate income households, if you're between 80% to 150% of the area median income, which is census tract based, it will cover up to 50% of your heat pump cost up to $8,000. So let's say if your heat pump cost, let's go with the $8,000. If your heat pump costs $8,000, if you come from a low income household, it'll cover 100% of those costs. Whereas if you're from a moderate income household, it'll cover 50% of that heat pump cost. So if you're low income and it's $8,000, if you come from a low income household and you purchase or you make that purchase, it's going to cover 100% of that cost. Whereas if you're from a moderate income, it'll cover $4,000 of that heat pump. And another thing to be mindful with this particular one, with this particular funding, any other qualified electrification projects, it's capped at $4,000. Now, separate from the rebate, there is a tax credit, and this is 30%, and it's capped at $2,000 per year. So it's 30% of that overall cost. And you would find that the great thing about the tax credit when you're doing your tax returns, 2024 for 2023, it gives you that particular line. So in 25C, this is where you will be applying and inputting this information on the tax credit when you make that heat pump purchase. So cover a 30% tax credit for heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. It caps it at $2,000. So in addition to that rebate that you would get, you could then file this also as a tax credit, and it caps it at $2,000. Another great thing too, and we'll go into more detail on some of these other items. If you're looking to get a heat pump water heater, and going back to that electrification project, it also includes a 30% tax credit up to $600 for an electrical panel upgraded. But this is only if it's upgraded in conjunction with another upgrade covered by 25C, like a heat pump. So sometimes, if you're already looking at potentially upgrading your electric panel, and you're looking at making a purchase like a heat pump, it may or may not be advantageous to do both at once. Of course, Doing a lot of these upgrades collectively can be a lot, can be very costly. So if you're able to do it, it's great because you could take advantage of this. But if not, you could definitely apply for these funding year after year for the next 10 years. And I'll make another note at that point. The tax credits and the tax rebates, because of Inflation Reduction Act, when it was passed into federal law, all this funding was set aside for the next 10 years. You could apply for these tax credits and rebates for the next 10 years, each year and each year. So even if you're capped at $2,000 per year, if you reach that cap in 1 year, you could reapply for it again the following year. And then the other good thing about the Rewiring America calculator is that it gives you the estimated cost for that upgrade. And the estimated cost includes the kind of, so not just the purchase itself, but then also to the installation and any other kind of respective upgrades that are needed and necessary to make that purchase and to make that heat pump work. So, I mean, this is a representative cost. Of course, a lot of it has to do with the contractor, where you're living at, so on and so forth. But yeah, here, let's go back and we'll play with another one back at the calculator. So let's go ahead and let's actually go to a tax credit itself. So let's say if you're looking at a heat pump water heater, that's the amount they could write off as a tax credit, $2,000. It's available now. But again, of course, it's 2023. So when you're doing your taxes for 2024, this was already available, so you could do it for 2023. We'll go to more info. Gives you the lifespan of the heat pump water heater, how it works, how efficient they are. And then here's the upfront discount. So when you're looking at purchasing a heat pump water heater, you could save up to $1,750, and it depends on the income. Like I mentioned earlier, it covers up to $1,750. Depending on your income, it'll cover 100% of that. Depending of that, the heat pump water costs up to $1,750. If you're moderate income, it covers 50% of that. And then they could be, and of course, these rebates are implemented differently in each state. And even though they are available, different states may have additional discounts or less discounts. It really fluctuates. And that is something that you would really want to redirect to a state entity, or when you're working with a vendor on purchasing, this is something that you could definitely ask, or even also with your tax preparer, they could help you out. And the tax credit, like I mentioned, 30% capped at $2,000 per year. And you would, again, find this, you would input all this information in line 25C. So yeah, let's get back to the electrification presentation itself. So let's go on the tax credits. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a tax credit, line 25D, and then line 25C. So line 25D, it's going to cover all the projects that makes your residential energy efficient. So if you're looking at solar panel installation, any the system that's connected with the solar panels itself, the electrical, the wiring, so on and so forth, that would be found as a tax credit on line 25D. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're looking at upgrading your electrical panel, specifically with solar, you may be eligible for an uncapped 30% tax credit, whatever that total cost is. And then with line 25C for the energy efficient home improvement credit, this also includes home energy audits and also electrical panels, as well as in conjunction with another upgrade. And you'll find that all in 25C and back again on that IRA calculator where I was explaining the heat pump water heater, the tax credit, so on and so forth. But that will be found on line 25C. And now let's go on to the rebates. So with the rebate programs, you have 2 rebate programs. There's a high efficiency electric home rebate program. That one is going to cover all your energy efficient appliances, induction stoves, heat pump water heaters, heat pump water coolers, and other energy efficient refrigerators, so on and so forth, that will be covered. With electric and induction stoves, it covers up to $840. 100% for low income. If you're qualified and identified as low income, or 50% for moderate income. With the heat pump water heaters up to $1,750. Again, 100% for low income, 50% for moderate income. Now with the other program, the Homeowner Managing Energy Savings Program, HOMES, this covers any energy efficient retrofits. So if you're looking at modernizing and upgrading your electrical panel, covers up to $4,000. It's at 100% for low income and 50% for moderate income. Whatever that final cost is, covers up to $4,000, 100% of it going back, 50% for moderate income. If you're doing also electrical wiring as you're doing other upgrades, it covers up to $2,500. And then also another thing, which a lot of individuals, or just to make you all aware, there's weatherization funding available through the IRA. So if you're looking at installing energy efficient doors, energy efficient windows, insulation, so on and so forth, there's up to $1,600 for that. The IRS, and we will be providing links at the very end of this video, at the very end of this recording. There is actual guidelines on how much per door, how much per window is covered, but we will provide that link at the very end for that. Also want to make you all aware of electric stoves, induction stoves. A lot of people tend to be relatively hesitant. They don't think that they heat up pans and pots as well as a traditional stovetop. But also too, like, one of the things that we want to emphasize with electric stoves is, let me go ahead and play this video, which will explain that to you.
Cooking on a gas stove emits benzene, a cancer-causing chemical. One lit burner can create kitchen benzene concentrations similar to secondhand smoke. Benzene drifts throughout the house and remains in the air for hours. Stanford University scientists measured bedroom benzene concentrations in multiple homes. Bedroom benzene concentrations spiked for hours after cooking with gas, often exceeding international benzene exposure limits. Benzene is a carcinogen. There's no safe level of exposure. Read the report.
And the report is on here, and we'll provide that also as well at the very end. But yeah, electric stoves, albeit expensive, it may be not just a climate change related upgrade, especially as we're all tackling climate change as individual consumers. There's also great health benefit, especially, and this also depends to like how great or poor your insulation and the airflow is at your within your house, within your property. The benzene and some of the other indoor air pollution and emissions coming out of burning natural gas from a stovetop in your home could be very detrimental to your health. So that's also another great thing as you're looking at appliance upgrades and making that electric stove upgrade. Now we will be going on to talking about electric vehicles. And this one will be relatively straightforward. With electric vehicles, there is an electric vehicle tax credit. And that credit goes up to, it covers up to $7,500. And it's based on the following. Half of that is based on whether 40% of that critical battery minerals are sourced from countries the US has free trade agreement with. So it comes out 40, so that 3750 depends on where your battery is sourced and built at. And then the other half is also where the components for the vehicle and the battery are sourced just as above. So depending on the vehicle that you purchase, you could get up to the full amount of $7,500, or depending on some of these components, you could get half of it. The great thing about the EV tax credit, the $7,500 tax credit, is that starting in 2024, this credit will be taken at the point of sale. So as opposed to, let's say, if you buy an electric vehicle that qualifies for the full $7,500 this year, in 2024, you'll be filing that as a tax credit. Whereas starting in 2024, if you go to the dealer, that $7,500 will just be taken off MSRP value when you're purchasing a vehicle. And the only limits that there are when purchasing an electric vehicle, cars, they cannot exceed $55,000 in MSRP. SUVs, trucks, and vans cannot exceed no more than $80,000. The only income eligibilities is if you're single, you cannot make no more than $150,000. For joint filers, you cannot have an income of more than $300,000 to qualify for these credits. And there is, for individuals who are interested at purchasing a used vehicle and are curious if there is a tax credit for used EVs, there is. So it is a 30% tax credit, which is capped at $4,000. The only thing though, is that the vehicle cannot exceed no more than $25,000 and when you're purchasing that used EV. So the vehicle has to be $25,000 or less. It has to be purchased, it cannot be purchased from a private party. It has to be purchased from a dealer, a used car dealer, in order to qualify, in order to get that $4,000, or qualify for that $4,000 tax credit. And sometimes, right now you may be curious, okay, that's great, that's awesome, I'm interested, but what vehicles can I get? What vehicle can I purchase? So there is this link there on this website from the US Department of Energy. It's called fueleconomy.gov. And the great thing about it is that it gives you the complete rundown, and it actually provides also information if you're interested in buying a plug-in hybrid. So there are additional funding and tax credits that you may qualify for, especially if you're purchasing a plug-in hybrid. So you purchase a vehicle anytime between April 18th, 2023 through December 31st. The awesome thing is that you could put in the model year, make and model, 2022 to 2024. Let's put in all the makes, all of that. Let's put in the electrics. These are the vehicles that qualify for that amount. The great thing about it is that this is what it tells you how much, and then it also tells you the limit. So Cadillac has Lyric. You get that full amount, that's $7,500. So it meets that MSRP limit at $80,000. And kind of like I mentioned, depending on where your battery is, the components, what percentage of it, you may not get the full credit. So the Ford E-Transit, especially if you run a small business and you're looking to get an EV van, the Ford E-Transit only covers half of it. And then also too, for the Mustang Mach-E, the standard range battery, and even also the extended range battery, you're only getting half of that credit as opposed to the full 7,500. The Rivians, you'll get half of that credit, not the full 7,500. All the Tesla models, the Model 3s, the Model Ys, you get the full $7,500, and then it gives you the MSRP. The Volkswagens, you got $7,500. And this list is as of July 20th, 2023. Then, like I mentioned earlier, these vehicles, you have to purchase them for your own use, not for resale. You're primarily using them in the US. And here's that kind of modified adjusted gross income. So when you're looking at applying for your tax returns in 2024 for 2023, like I mentioned, 300,000 for married couples filing jointly. If you're doing a head of households, is 225,000, and then for all other filers, it's $150,000. And then the great thing about this tool is that it gives you kind of where exactly you'll be inputting this information. So it'll be on line 11 on your form 1040. That's where on the IRS tax returns when you're doing them in 2024, you'll be putting this information. So you'll go to line 11 on your 1040. Usually the only information you need to input is a vehicle information number. So the VIN, year, make, model, and then and that should be more than enough. Of course, when you go to your form 1040 and line 11, and of course with your tax preparer, whoever may be that person for you, they will be able to properly input this information. Now we'll be going on to buildings. And with the buildings, the IRA funding, so with respect to buildings, so the building sector has in 2019, it accounted for about 33% of US greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. And the thing with buildings, so the investment in the IRA for buildings will result in lowering energy bills, improve health benefits, quality jobs, and reducing emissions. And I'll go a little bit more into detail on the other section on how these green codes and buildings will go into that. So I'll be covering this in a little bit more detail later on in this presentation. Now with energy transition. So with energy transition, there is the energy communities credit. There is about $10 billion in financing for rural renewable energy investments or debt relief through the USDA. And for businesses, private parties, tax exempt organizations, this will come through 48C, which is a manufacturing tax credit. And then there's also funding from the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program. And that will be under the US Department of, the USDA, US Department of Agriculture. And then also too, with the IRA, there is a permanent extension of the Black Lung excise tax. So that's another great thing about that. With the energy transition, with the IRA funding, these are the job creation potential. So with clean energy investment, just through the IRA for the job creation potential over the next 10 years, you're looking at 5 million jobs. Clean manufacturing supply chains, you're looking at 900,000 jobs across the country in the next 10 years. EVs and clean transportation, building those EVs, building the batteries in the US for those EVs, making those necessary charging stations, and also cleaning and modernizing our public transportation. You're looking at 400,000 jobs in the next 10 years. Energy efficiency improvements for homes and offices, we're already starting to see that. 900,000 jobs is expected over the next 10 years, but we're already starting to see that. With environmental justice and climate resiliency programs and funding, we're looking at about 150,000 jobs created in the next 10 years. Natural infrastructure, we're looking at 600,000 jobs being created in the next 10 years. There's a production tax credit and the investment tax credit. These tax credit programs, so they require developers to pay a prevailing wage and utilize a certain percentage of registered apprenticeships in the projects in order for developers and businesses to qualify for these tax credit programs. The great thing about this production tax credit and investment tax credit is that it establishes a bonus 10% domestic content tax credit for projects that use US-made iron, steel, and manufactured components. And then there's also 2 additional 10% tax credits that are available for clean energy projects. Now with resilient communities, there is a lot of funding for resilient communities. So building incentives for solar projects, and this is going back to that building section. And the goal for these incentives is to target energy communities. So when you're looking at communities that have historically been involved in fossil fuel production, so coal, oil, refineries, so on and so forth. There's a lot of funding going into energy communities. low-income communities that have been at the front line, that have been disproportionately impacted by climate change and environmental injustices, as well as tribal nations and tribal lands. That's really where a lot of this funding is going towards too. And then there's also additional funding for rural communities. There's $1 billion set aside for rural renewable electrification loans, and then 9.6 billion for rural electric cooperatives to streamline and get rural communities connected into greener energy grid systems and energy sources. Now there's besides the investment tax credit, there's 2 other programs. So there's environmental and climate justice block grants. And this is through the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So right now, the EPA is actually seeking public input on this new environmental and climate justice program, and helping distribute $3 billion in Inflation Reduction Act funding. So as we go through the EPA, you'll see through this particular website kind of the engagement opportunities, and then also requests for information. So there's ROIs right now. And then there's also these presentations that have already been previously recorded that further talk about those engagement opportunities. And you'll find the presentation slides right here, and the webinars as well, in both English and Spanish, which is a really awesome resource. With the investment tax credit, so this provision will be effective from 2022 to 2032. And reducing, but it will be reduced over the next coming years. So there will be a reduction to 26% of it in 2033 and 22% of it in 2034. Tax exempt entities, which are local cities, counties, school districts, nonprofit organizations, will be able to get direct pay as opposed to a tax credit. And then also when you're looking at battery storage for tax exempt entities for local localities and municipalities, if they're looking at battery storage, if they have solar available and you're looking at battery storage, this now qualifies as well. And now for the Rural Energy for America program, which is the REAP. So it has been provided over $2 billion for renewable energy systems and energy efficient improvement grants for agricultural producers and rural small business owners through 2031. And as we go on this website, which will also be provided at the end of this presentation, the great thing is that it gives you the eligibility requirements, the application itself, the program application, and then your respective state energy coordinator with which you could apply for to get this funding. And there are quarterly competitions. So within each quarter, there will be an application opening and an application deadline, and you would find all this information here. Now, we will be talking about agriculture. Now with energy transition. So with energy transition, there is the Energy Communities Credit. There is about $10 billion in financing for rural renewable energy investments or debt relief through the USDA. And for businesses, private parties, tax exempt organizations, this will come through 48C, which is a manufacturing tax credit. And then there's also funding from the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program. And that will be under the US Department of, the USDA, US Department of Agriculture. And then also too, with the IRA, there is a permanent extension of the Black Lung excise tax. So that's another great thing about that. With the energy transition, with the IRA funding, these are the job creation potential. So with clean energy investment, just through the IRA for the job creation potential over the next 10 years, you're looking at 5 million jobs. Clean manufacturing supply chains, you're looking at 900,000 jobs across the country in the next 10 years. EVs and clean transportation, building those EVs, building the batteries in the US for those EVs, making those necessary charging stations, and also cleaning and modernizing our public transportation. You're looking at 400,000 jobs in the next 10 years. Energy efficiency improvements for homes and offices. We're already starting to see that. 900,000 jobs is expected over the next 10 years, but we're already starting to see that. With environmental justice and climate resiliency programs and funding, we're looking at about 150,000 jobs created in the next 10 years. Natural infrastructure, we're looking at 600,000 jobs being created in the next 10 years. There's a production tax credit and the investment tax credit. These tax credit programs, so they require developers to pay a prevailing wage and utilize a certain percentage of registered apprenticeships in the projects in order for developers and businesses to qualify for these tax credit programs. The great thing about this production tax credit and investment tax credit is that it establishes a bonus 10% domestic content tax credit for projects that use US-made iron, steel, and manufactured components. And then there's also 2 additional 10% tax credits that are available for clean energy projects. Now, with resilient communities, there is a lot of funding for resilient communities. So building incentives for solar projects, and this is going back to that building section. And the goal for these incentives is to target energy communities. So when you're looking at communities that have historically been involved in fossil fuel production, so coal, oil, refineries, so on and so forth. There's a lot of funding going into energy communities, low-income communities that have been at the front line, that have been disproportionately impacted by climate change and environmental injustices, as well as tribal nations and tribal lands. That's really where a lot of this funding is going towards too. And then there's also additional funding for rural communities. There's $1 billion set aside for rural renewable electrification loans, and then $9.6 billion for rural electric cooperatives to streamline and get rural communities connected into greener energy grid systems and energy sources. Now there's besides the investment tax credit, there's 2 other programs. So there's environmental and climate justice block grants. And this is through the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So right now the EPA is actually seeking public input on this new environmental and climate justice program, and helping distribute $3 billion in Inflation Reduction Act funding. So as we go through the EPA, you'll see through this particular website kind of the engagement opportunities, and then also requests for information. So there's ROIs right now, and then there's also these presentations that have already been previously recorded that further talk about those engagement opportunities. And you'll find the presentation slides right here, and the webinars as well, in both English and Spanish, which is a really awesome resource. With the investment tax credit, so this provision will be effective from 2022 to 2032, and reducing, but it will be reduced over the next coming years. So there will be a reduction to 26% of it in 2033 and 22% of it in 2034. Tax exempt entities, which are local cities, counties, school districts, nonprofit organizations, will be able to get direct pay as opposed to a tax credit. And then also when you're looking at battery storage for tax exempt entities for local localities and municipalities, if they're looking at battery storage, if they have solar available and you're looking at battery storage, this now qualifies as well. And now for the Rural Energy for America program, which is the REAP. So it has been provided over $2 billion for renewable energy systems and energy efficient improvement grants for agricultural producers and rural small business owners through 2031. And as we go on this website, which will also be provided at the end of this presentation, the great thing is that it gives you the eligibility requirements, the application itself, the program application, and then your respective state energy coordinator with which you could apply for to get this funding. And there are quarterly competitions. So within each quarter, there will be an application opening and an application deadline, and you would find all this information here. Now, we will be talking about agriculture. So with agriculture, there's a lot of funding that was set aside. $20 billion is being invested into agriculture conservation programs, which are these four bubbles that you see right here. It's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, and the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. These offer substantial opportunities to bolster regenerative agriculture and soil health, and this will be done through the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. This funding is aimed at farming practices that both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve carbon storage. And also to, as I mentioned way earlier in the video itself, this will also go at coastal and conservation efforts to protect wetlands and other over-farmed, overdeveloped land. Let's start with the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So with the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, it provides technical and financial assistance to agricultural producers and forest landowners to address water and air quality, conserve ground and surface water, increasing soil health, and improving wildlife habitats, as well as doing mitigation and improving mitigation against drought and increasing weather volatility, especially with a lot of the climate change that we're going on. We're seeing a lot of fluctuation in our weather, and we're seeing a lot of our farming community and our food growers being disproportionately impacted. So there's a lot of funding through EQIP to provide for that. The great thing with EQIP is that it allows, when you're applying for an EQIP program, you're working one-on-one with the NRCS to develop a conservation plan. And then another thing too is that each state has its own respective EQIP initiatives that they are funding and providing technical support and assistance with. And that is EQIP in a nutshell. With the Conservation Stewardship Program, so these are fund practices that have been determined by the USDA to directly improve soil carbon. The Conservation Stewardship Program funds practices that reduce nitrogen losses and lowers the emissions of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide associated with agricultural protection. And it also too, the IRA extends support for organic producers. And really the emphasis on this is soil carbon enhancement and carbon sequestration and emission reduction to promote sustainable agricultural practices. Now the Regional Conservation Program Partnership, RCPP. These fund projects that include a range of on-the-ground conservation. So we're looking at land management and improvement and restoration, watersheds and public works programs, conservation easements that restore, protect, manage, maintain, enhance, and monitor conservation on US and entity held lands. So when we're talking about entity held lands, that is conservation programs, societies such as the Audubon Society, so on and so forth, other entities that own publicly held lands for conservation purposes. So that's kind of what the Regional Conservation Partnership Program funds. And then the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. This is aimed at protecting the agricultural viability and related conservation values of eligible land. The ACEP has two components. So agricultural land easements to protect croplands and grasslands on working farms and ranches. Wetland reserve easements to protect, restore, and enhance wetlands that have been degraded through agricultural uses. And the NRCS is partnering and is providing funding for private, tribal, state, and local governments to leverage these resources to carry out the high priority protection and restoration programs. So that is really our electrification roadshow in a nutshell. Thank you all so much for watching. Links and other information that was used in this presentation will be provided at the end of this presentation, as well as in the description box, which you would find below. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to leave a comment on here, to reach out to us via social media or via email. We're at chesapeakeclimate.org. Please reach out for any questions, comments, feedback, or if you need additional support to access and get more information on these particular fundings and programs and tax credits and rebates and incentives. Again, my name is Ernesto Villaseñor. I'm the federal campaign coordinator with Chesapeake Climate Action. Thank you all so much. I hope this was very helpful for you.